Hello. Welcome back to Full Time with Meg Linehan. I'm Tamerra Griffin. I am joined, of course, by my co-host, Meg Linehan. And this week, at long last, it feels like we are finally getting into U.S. Women's National Team stuff. We've been a little busy, as I'm sure you have too. But they do have two big friendlies coming up, and we are going to be breaking down the roster, talking about other news surrounding the U.S. Women's National Team, and previewing this window. Meg, how are you doing? Have you caught your breath? I haven't. I'm not going to lie, I have not.
Not really. I do feel like I was a little worried about losing my voice over the course of NWSL Championship Week. I do feel like that is a real tradition. I have my NWSL Championship hat on.
Love it.
Yeah, I mean, it's really now just a matter of like catching up on sleep for this entire week amidst holiday travel. So I feel like that's probably the case for I mean, like walking through the Kansas City airport this weekend on the way out, it was just like, I mean, a lot of Chiefs stuff, obviously, because they were playing that day, but also, I mean, it was NWSL gear everywhere. It was very fun to see.
Yeah, just based on like the different group chats I dipped into, it felt very much like a who's who at the airport because everyone was going back around the same time. A lot of people seeing players and vice versa.
I did see our friend Melissa Etheridge walking through on her way. I think probably on the same flight as Allie Riley. So, you know,
back to
fun
LA.
Times. It really was a parade of like everyone who traveled in was then traveling out. So, good times.
Yes. I'm going to miss the wave. I'm actually still in Kansas City. Hope to get some barbecue though on my way out. But along with...
Very clutch.
Yeah. Along with this look ahead now and this pivot to U.S. Women's National Team news, we also have to talk about something that is happening next year that feels almost a bit like a similar holiday as NWSL Championships, which is the She Believes Cup, which is having its 10-year anniversary next year. 3 games this time, up now from 2 in 2024, and some slightly new faces to this tournament, with one standby, of course, in Japan.
Kind of.
It's been a minute. I feel like usually Brazil is in this, but they're kind of swapped. I feel like they're passing the torch maybe to Colombia. No?
A little bit. I mean, it's Colombia, Australia, Japan. I feel like these are 3 teams the U.S. has seen plenty of. I mean, one of the, I think, really exciting parts of this tournament, too, is that this could be Sam Kerr's return to international play by the time this tournament rolls around. So there is maybe a little bit of like, oh, we're going to see some Sam Kerr, maybe Christy Mewis floating around. We didn't even mention it last week, but having a baby, right? So like a lot of things happening in the Kerr Mewis household. Yeah, I mean, Colombia, obviously they've seen a lot of just between CONCACAF, W Gold Cup, and just in general. And then Japan, yes. I feel like the U.S. Women's National Team has seen so much of Japan. But that's going to be the norm. Just, again, it's so hard to book European teams. So I think that's why 2 friendlies coming up are so important, because they're actually going to get a little bit of time in Europe against European teams. But still some exciting games and new locations, too.
Totally. I mean, I am never going to complain about getting to watch Japan play personally. But yes, new locations for these games, especially in terms of She Believes Cup. The first set of games are going to be in Houston at Shell Energy Stadium. The second set of games are actually going to be in Glendale, Arizona. Shout out Michael Wilson, Sophia Smith's fiance, who plays for the Arizona Cardinals, at that same stadium. And shout out to the both of them for their adorable new puppy, just as a side note, now that we're talking about new additions to soccer families.
Yeah. Just as a dachshund person myself, I saw that and I was like, I gotta get to Sophia Smith. We gotta discuss. They're all the same. Like, just every time I ever talk to someone about having a dachshund, like, they are very sweet dogs. They're so stubborn. They're just so specific. Like, they're all they've got a vibe, and so I'm just like, you will enjoy the ride, but like, you're gonna learn real quick that these dogs are very, very stubborn.
Yeah, I mean, the few things that I've learned about DeWitt, just based on the like feeding time calls, speaks a lot to what you're saying.
Yeah.
DeWitt is Meg's dog, if for those of you who weren't aware. But the third match is going to be a familiar, if not slightly skeptical, location in Snapdragon Stadium in San Diego. Obviously, this is a stadium that has been the subject of the kind of conversations you hope to avoid when speaking of stadiums. There have been more than a few player injuries there. They recently were not able to play an NWSL game there due to those field conditions. So, some questions and maybe crinkled eyebrows there, right, Meg?
Well, just like you also think back to the last time the U.S. Women's National Team was in Snapdragon Stadium, and that was the slip and slide game against Canada.
Oh my God, how could I forget?
So, in a not that dissimilar part of the year. So I understand that they're limited to like warmer locations for She Believes Cup, and it is good that like it's back, we're out of a major tournament year, so this international window is back to a 3-game window. But yeah, Snapdragon Stadium, I do think everybody when we saw that announcement was just like, okay, I guess that's gonna, because it's not just the fact that San Diego Wave couldn't play there. I think everybody went back and was like, the last time it was there, it was an unplayable game. But okay, we'll do it again.
I mean, I suppose the glass half full way of looking at this is that this is an opportunity to sort of set a new vibe in this stadium, maybe like the soccer equivalent of smudging it with sage. Remains to be seen. What we do know is that She Believes Cup takes place from February 20th to 26th, 2025. So maybe start clearing space on your calendars for that. But Meg, we are still breathing the fumes of this NWSL championship. And we have to talk about the crazy flight itinerary that the Orlando Pride had after they won the championship this weekend, because they were on a flight the next morning back to Orlando.
Yeah, they were up and at 'em. I mean, maybe that's the vibe of first time in the championship, but I do think because Orlando City, the MLS team, is also going through playoffs right at the moment. There was this drive to get the team back into Orlando, and Seb Hines, head coach, and Haley Carter, general manager, were out on the field with the trophies. So I think that was a really fun and cool moment to actually see some of that. I think we've seen it in Portland a little bit. So to finally have that moment in Orlando in a full stadium, we'll set that one aside. But to maybe have some exposure of just look, men's team's fans, your women's team just won a championship. Maybe you should go next year. It's just a good moment for Orlando in a lot of ways.
Totally. And it just reminds me of what Seb Hines has been saying repeatedly throughout the season, honestly, both about his relationship to the city of Orlando. He played for City for several years before transitioning to coaching with the youth level at Orlando City as the club and then moving over to the Pride. So for him to not only show up but receive the reception that he did from the crowd really did kind of illustrate how committed he is to the city, to the club, and to getting as many trophies for them as possible.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's a fun moment of just we have not always seen that umbrella, right, of the organization with the MLS and the NWSL side kind of have that one team mentality, and Seb is that kind of perfect intersection. Bridge. And so for him to get that moment too, I think is very fun and cool and something that we haven't really seen before in the NWSL.
Truly. This is the season, and I don't even just mean NWSL season, but the season of doing things that we have not seen before, and I am so here for it. But speaking of the NWSL Championship, we captured so much cool video, audio. We had a whole show, the beginning of which took place at CPKC Stadium on the ground amidst the glitter, that if you have not watched on YouTube, I strongly recommend, especially if you're a fan of glitter. But in order to do that, you have to be following us everywhere on social media at TA Fulltime on Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, all the places. We want to hear from you always, and we don't want you to miss out on good content either. So we're going to take a quick break, and when we get back, we are going to start our U.S. Women's National Team discussion with some Michelle Kang news. Stick with us. All right, Meg, before we get into the U.S. Women's National Team games, we have to talk first about the Michelle Kang news as it relates to U.S. soccer. Last Tuesday, she announced that she was making a $30 million donation to the Federation, which obviously has huge financial implications to it, but also says a lot about what we can sort of expect in U.S. soccer in the U.S. for women, right? I mean, this is like a multi-layer donation. We have to break it down.
This represents more than just financial support. It's about establishing an enduring foundation for the future of women's soccer. A foundation that starts with youth level and expands to include players, referees, coaches, and staff. And one that will create a self-sustaining ecosystem where soccer can thrive long-term for women and girls across the nation. We can't build lasting success by focusing solely on professional teams, leagues, or dedicated training facilities and stadiums. They're all great, necessary. But to truly professionalize and elevate the women's game, it's essential to me that we develop every element of the ecosystem, starting from the earliest stage of soccer development. We are at a defining moment for women's sports. The energy and momentum are undeniable, but this momentum requires action. By investing today, we can build a system in which every young girl sees a clear path to success. The foundation we lay now will support generations of players, coaches, and leaders to come. The time to invest is now, and the opportunity to make a lasting impact has never been greater. So let's seize this moment and ensure that the future of women's soccer is as limitless as the potential of the athletes who play it. Thank you.
Yeah, I was in, so I changed my championship travel plans to go to New York City to go to this announcement and speak with Michelle Kang about the why and how, right? Because I think anytime you get a donation of that size, it's the largest donation that's ever been made to U.S. soccer that will go directly to the women's program. It's the second largest donation I think they've gotten, at least in recent times, behind Arthur Blank's $50 million that was set aside for the National Training Center. But what I think is really interesting about Michelle Kang's donation is, you're thinking, okay, she's coming at this from an NWSL owner. She's got international ambition with Lyon, London City Lionesses, I think probably more teams. She's got Kineska, which is that sort of medical innovation, right? She's got her hands in a lot of different places at the moment. Mm-hmm. And then to come in and say, okay, I'm going to give you $30 million over 5 years, and it's going to go to kind of these specific things across the women's program. That's doubling camps for youth national teams. That's building out this scouting, talent development program, maybe just increasing the size of youth national teams across the board at U.S. Soccer on the women's side. And then finally a coaching and mentorship program for coaches and referees for the women's game. And none of those are honestly like big shiny objects, right? She's not going to have her name put on a training center. And honestly, I think like once this news dies down, like it will always be a part of her bio or whatever, but these things like don't get very regular coverage in this space. And so it is really interesting of like, okay, you do this big, very Michelle Kang announcement near Lincoln Center, right? Like beautiful location, all of that sort of stuff. And then it's going to, I think, be a challenge to keep some of these more foundational building blocks in public view. And that was almost the challenge that she threw down as well of like, I need you to pay attention to these things, like what's happening at the youth national team level. I need to like spur other people to invest because it can't just be me doing this. And I think we saw that for U.S. Soccer with the Arthur Blank donation is that other people have stepped up and said, oh, okay, like you need money for these specific things. And then, yeah, it is interesting because I think there are still a lot of people who are very skeptical of Michelle Kang in a lot of different ways just because like there is such an influx of money, right, coming from her. And you think back to when she took over the Washington Spirit and it was this $35 million price tag and everyone was looking around like, that's not a $35 million team, right? And that investment now is just like, oh, okay, like she kicked off, honestly, what is kind of this modern era of NWSL in terms of valuations and the business of the sport. So it's going to be very interesting, I think, to see how this plays out long term. But there is, yes, like so much to unpack. But I think it's worth starting maybe of like why she chose US soccer, because there's probably a lot of like, why would you ever do that? Right? Just especially from the women's program side of things.
Yeah. And when I look at just the portfolio of the Washington Spirit, Lyon, and London City Lionesses, I can see pretty clearly how she was able to identify the areas of opportunity for growth as quickly as she was. You have an NWSL team, you have a legacy French team, and then you have like an up and coming English women's team. And to be able to see sort of like the common threads across 3 different countries, 3 different clubs, obviously, it's not surprising to know or to see where she wants this donation to be like directed to and focused on. And honestly, even if we look at that NWSL championship and the questions that people had around some of the decisions that the referees were making in a game like that, you can see that. And I mean, in the chances that we do have in the media to touch on these issues, we do. But to your point, there is not always space, there's not always time, but there is definitely a need. And I agree. I mean, I don't think it's wrong to have questions of people who have loads of money, like what is she hiding underneath those like beautiful capes? But it's also hard to argue with the money, you know? At the same time, we will have to wait and see what changes are actually taking place before we can make real calls around the efficacy of this donation. But it's hard to deny that this is a skeptical or, you know, questionable choice.
I mean, I think it is. I asked JT Batson, CEO of US Soccer, like, how are these things going to be tracked? Like, where are the metrics going to be? All of that sort of stuff. And part of it is like, this just happened, right? So he was like, okay, hang on. But I mean, the youth national team camps are going to be doubled, like right from the jump. So like, there are things that they're going to be able to pull off. But I think because that donation is staggered over the next 5 years, that there is this chance to actually build and not necessarily put the expectations of from year one, we're going to go from, 9,000 kids in this talent ID and development system to, whatever number they want to hit. I mean, they're talking about like hundreds of thousands, right? So it's going to be able to be a little bit more of a slower build and like actually build out that infrastructure. But I do think like holding U.S. soccer accountable, I also think Michelle Kang is 100% going to hold U.S. soccer accountable to like, I gave you a lot of money. I want to see what happens with it. So from that point of view, I think I am honestly like a little less concerned maybe, but it has been interesting just of, I wrote a story around the donation, but really turned into more of a profile around Michelle Kang because Pablo Maurer from The Athletic and I had sat down with her like honestly a couple months after the Washington Sail Spirit had gone through, and that interview never really got used in its entirety. So I revisited a lot of what she told me about her childhood growing up in South Korea, like her family, her education coming over from a time of like complete turmoil in South Korea, and using that honestly a little bit against her parents who were very concerned about her safety. Like universities were being shut down after the assassination of the South Korean president, and so there was a coup, right? Like it was this time of just, getting an education at that moment was not an easy thing. And so she came over, went to the University of Chicago, stayed, went to Yale for her master's in business, and just kind of launched herself. And what's fascinating to me is, and if you've ever kind of seen a Michelle Kang interview or spent any time with her, she knows what she's about. She knows what she's about. And she had these like 3-decade-long plans for what she wanted to do with her life. And she kind of hit them all. And then her plan for the 4th decade was philanthropy. And she found women's soccer right at the start of that 4th decade, right? Like, right as she was like, okay, I'm looking for my next thing. I invest in the Kennedy Center, whatever it is. She's on all these boards. 2019 World Cup happens, and she just kind of nosedives into it. And I don't know if she has another mode. And I always think it's worth questioning. Like, there is no such thing as a perfect owner, right? Like, she can be completely ruthless when it comes to business, when it comes to decisions around the team even. I think about Mark Parsons only getting a year with the Washington Spirit, right? So like you have to kind of view her as this complete person. But at the same time, I do sometimes get a little like $30 million into U.S. soccer for some of what is happening around this donation, I think is a little bit harder to question than, okay, coming in and buying Lyon, this legacy team, and people being a little anxious about what are you going to change about this? There is this history here. And you can say all these nice things of you're not going to change it, you're not going to move it, all that. But I think there is always that sort of concern about someone new coming into a space and not knowing what their motives are.
And I think to add even another dimension to that, when I think about her in her capacity as Washington Spirit owner, I cannot name another owner in this league who is more highly visible than Michelle Kang. And I'm not just talking about seeing her popping up on Instagram, visiting players when they're training. I'm talking about her going out and visiting fans ahead of the NWSL final. She was giving them free pizza during Fan Fest ahead of the game.
Yeah.
And they, and they respond. They cheer for her as if she is like one of the starting 11. And that is also not something that we see across this league. And I wonder if she is, now, as you've mentioned, this is someone who is extremely calculated and organized about her decisions. So I know that this is also a part of that strategy in some way. But I do wonder if she is sort of changing what it means to be the face of a team as an owner, and whether or not other owners in this league are going to try and maybe mold themselves now to sort of hang with that, because it means something when you're able to see an owner at every game. And when she's, double screening when she's in France watching the Spirit or the Lionesses, like that matters.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think like you can read it more cynically, right? Of like, oh, are you trying to buy fans? But also I think even if there is a cynical reading of it, like it still is building this community around it. Like, I think fundamentally as an owner, you have to understand that like tending to that community and taking care of them and thinking about game day experience and thinking about experience outside of game day. I mean, the fact that the Spirit had a celebration on Monday night, and that celebration was happening regardless of whether they won or lost. Like that to me is honestly a very classy move out of the Spirit, out of Michelle Kang, and something that like Gotham struggled with last year, trying to get an event, and they won, right? Like the planning was there in place because she knew this is going to be important to fans. It does not matter if we win or lose. We want to celebrate and appreciate them. And like, yes, you can read that cynically, but I think you can also read it, even if you're reading it through a cynical lens of like, she understands how important this group is to the success of her business. And that is just like pure client relationships.
Agreed. And honestly, with all things in the NWSL and life, I would say in general, you got to take both. Like, don't ever get so swayed by free pizza. I know it's hard. Trust me, I know it's hard. That you're not asking critical questions. That's what it means to be a human being in this world. And that's certainly what it means to be contributing to the growth of this game in any sort of way. All right. We 100%. Are going to take a quick break. And when we get back, we're diving into this U.S. women's national team roster. All right. At long last, we can talk about the team now, the U.S. women's national team. They have 2 friendlies coming up. The first on November 30th against England at Wembley Stadium. Big game. And the second on December 3rd against the Netherlands. Now, Meg, before we talk about who is on this roster, let's get what really ended up being sort of the headline news when this roster dropped out of the way, which is who is not on it. I'm talking about Triple Espresso. Mm-hmm. Thoughts?
Yes. Well, now, post NWSL Championship, I think everyone is like, thank God.
Yeah.
Right? Like, Sophia Smith kind of struggling at the end of the season. Mel Swanson kind of struggling at the end of the season. Trinity Rodman holding her back in the NWSL Championship game. Like, everyone have a restful holiday season. Have fun. Take naps, chill out. And so, yeah, I think there was initially some panic. I know I got at least a couple comments of like, why wouldn't we want their strongest roster there? And it's like, it's not that necessary. Like, yes, I think any game against England in England, you want the strongest possible team there. But I don't know. I do also kind of like the theory that it doesn't hurt the U.S. to have England not see them in that kind of Olympic form, right? To keep that something that they have not seen in person. So I kind of like both parts of this right at the moment. That in the get rest, and like it's something that England won't have to play against for a bit for the U.S. women's national team. So across the board, correct decision.
Yeah, I had a similar thought about the strategy of not showing certain cards right away. But even more so, those girls need to rest. I think, honestly, just as much about the physical toll of the Olympics, even more so, honestly, I want them to have this rest for the emotional toll, because it wasn't just the Olympics. It was the Olympics coming off of that World Cup the previous year. I can only imagine the expectations that they were shouldering. I can only imagine the nerves, even like energy output that they weren't even aware of at the time until probably it was all over. But then they had to dive right back into the NWSL. All three of those teams were in the hunt for playoffs. Like there was no letting their foot up off the gas at all this year, really. And so just for that reason alone, and then of course, stress affects the body physically. Like, it's time. It's time to like put on the fuzzy socks for all of them, cozy up, like have the snacks brought to you. They all got booze who can do that work. Like, it's time. And I do think that Emma Hayes as a manager has shown, especially during her time at Chelsea, how seriously she takes being able to allow players to rest and manage that aspect of their welfare too. So honestly, I was not totally surprised. And more so, I understood it. Now, let's talk about who is on this roster for the first time. Fallon Joyce, who is a goalkeeper for Manchester United, and Ali Sentnor, who is fresh off really an understated but incredible season, both for club and country. Very deserved, don't you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think both are. What is really interesting to me, too, is that Emma Hayes is very much doing her exploration of the goalkeeping pool overall, right? Like, we have seen her kind of bounce from person to person. And I think that is because everybody kind of knows where Alyssa Nair is in her career. I think there is maybe a clear successor already in place with Casey Murphy, but I think there is a chance here where everyone is kind of relatively young right at the moment to think about, okay, like, who are we putting in these spots? Who, if there is a clear number 2, who's the clear number 3? And so to actually be able to evaluate all of these people in the U.S. women's national team environment is very exciting. And I think Fallon Joyce has been off of people's radars a little bit after she left the reins to go to Manchester United. So Joyce coming in is definitely an interesting one, but I think maybe something that's been a little overdue. And she's obviously been having a good season in England, so it's about that time. But Ali Sentnor too, Utah U20s. I think everybody was waiting for that. But again, Emma Hayes, knowing the value of rest, was like, she just played a World Cup. We will see her when we see her. Don't worry about it. We know who she is.
Totally. And her having just been on the club side, she's probably experienced this from the other end of having club players who are, going off to international duty and coming back all banged up and exhausted. So she does, I think, really have a unique perspective there. But there is sort of a third category debutante, someone who is going to be playing for the U.S. women's national team for the first time since she declared her commitment to this country. I'm talking about Lily Yohannes. This is both not surprising for me because I really think that it was just a matter of waiting for her to make this decision, whenever that might have been. She, in my conversations with her from the profile that I wrote about her earlier this year, was always clear that she was going to take as much time that she needed, that she was not in a rush. She was only 16 at the time we spoke. Now she's only 17.
Yeah.
And she's made her choice. And there's a part of me that can see the okay, well, we don't need to waste much time anymore. But I am not missing the sort of palace intrigue of the fact that she could potentially play one of her first games officially for the U.S. women's national team against the Netherlands, the other country that she needed to decide between.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's
there is
spicy.
what a storyline. Yeah, what a storyline from the jump for Lily Yohannes. But maybe you can talk to us too a little bit about why the decision, that seemed to me like, first of all, Emma Hayes was as totally willing, like, you're going to get that space that you need. And I think The other interesting part too is that when Emma Hayes talks about her, it's just like, okay, she is 17. She's going to need to, like, you cannot expect her to come in and be like the savior of the U.S. women's national team midfield from day one. And what is it? Why is that so important in terms of like having Emma Hayes like be on that page with her at this point in her international career?
One thing that I do admire about Emma Hayes' approach, especially as the U.S. women's national team head coach, is her patience. And I think that when you have a player like Lily Yohannes, who is undeniably a generational talent, I imagine that you have to fight against the urge to just throw them into everything and get them to develop them at sort of this accelerated pace that oftentimes, as history has shown, sometimes is a recipe for disaster because things have to happen at a certain time. There are physical, psychological, emotional aspects to this development. It's not just what happens on the field. And it does seem like Emma is like deeply aware of what that means. So the fact that she, at least publicly has not shown any sense of like urgency and wanting Lily to make a decision by any certain date, I think speaks to that. I think the fact that she's calling her into this camp at the same time speaks to her enthusiasm to have her be included sooner than later. She may get some minutes in the England game. She may get some minutes in the Netherlands game. Just looking at the roster and how many newer faces there are generally, it's hard to imagine her not getting any minutes. But in terms of the decision, I have to look back at that first camp that she attended earlier this year against those friendlies against South Korea. I mean, even before you get to the fact that she scored her first goal after 10 minutes on the field, she has spoken about how impactful that experience was for her. And I think that was actually illustrated by the way the team completely just enveloped her in the celebration after she scored that goal. She has support from older players like Sophia Smith and Kat Macario. She seemed like she was having a good time. And if I'm putting myself in her shoes, I can understand how much of a statement that makes. Because if that's just your first experience in camp, imagine being in camp during a World Cup year or an Olympic year and how much you're able to build upon those relationships, how much you're able to learn from those around you, both at the player level and the staff level. I'm not quite as clued in to what her experiences have been like with the Netherlands, but I do know that her experience with the U.S. just during that one camp left a mark on her. And it's hard to imagine that not weighing pretty heavily into her decision making.
Yeah. I mean, I think Johannes is a really good launching point, too, for what the U.S. needs to get out of this window, because I don't think it's as straightforward as people might expect it to be. I think anytime they go to Europe, there's going to obviously be the desire for this big statement win. The last time the U.S. went to Wembley, they did lose, right? And then they ended up going to Spain that next game and got thrashed by a pretty limited Spain team, right? And that was immediately in the fallout of the Yates report coming out around abuse in the NWSL. And I just remember like being over in London and everybody's like, oh, this game. I'm like, I just need you to know, like, everyone's a disaster right now, right? Emotionally. So I think, this year it is kind of, they're coming off the Olympics. They're coming off this big high. It's not necessarily the same team. All those debutantes from the last October friendlies are back. 2 more, right? Like, this is now the beginning of the next cycle. But I think there's also something really interesting, too, in everybody thinking about England in particular, just the Emma Hayes Bowl of it all. England's last result against Germany and how that game went. So, like, England also desperately wants a result in this game. Whereas I think for the U.S., that pressure does not feel on in the same way.
I agree. That England-Germany game had so many shades of NWSL After Dark. It would take like a whole other segment to this podcast to get into that. But if you watch the game and you follow the NWSL, you know what I'm talking about. But I agree. I think that after coming off of that Euros win, of course, that's going to set even higher expectations. They made it to the finals of the World Cup and fell to Spain. They have, even though the players that they have been routinely calling up to the Lionesses squad are not giving the same kind of new, let's bring some new faces into camp that we are seeing with the US, it does still feel like they are in something of a rebuild in the past few months. And between that and the fact that they are playing at home at Wembley, I definitely think that there is a lot more onus and expectation on England to show up in this game against the US. But at the same time, I love the fact that we are going to be seeing players like Yasmin Ryan, Emma Sears, Eva Gaetino play in this big hyped up atmosphere for the US, because that, as we've said many times before, is experience that the US unfortunately doesn't get very often, but that you're going to need heading into 2027 and all of these other global tournaments. So honestly, this is sort of a best case scenario for the US, especially these newer players to the national team that we're seeing. Even, I mean, peace be on Emily Sams's quadriceps, because she's coming off of this NWSL championship and diving straight into England. But I'm so excited to see her play, because even in those first experiences during the last window, she shows clearly that she has a spot on this team. Meg, is there anyone else that you're looking forward to seeing in these set of friendlies?
I will say, also a friend of the pod, Hal Hirschfeld. I think we saw in that NWSL championship game, we've been talking about next dog. Her reaction to that yellow card, to the point where I was like, Hal, turn it down a little bit, right? And but like, there is a large part of me that's like, put that girl on the field in Wembley. Stat. I want to see that energy in Wembley and just watch the fireworks. So there is, I think, some really exciting stuff, both from an Orlando Pride and Washington Spirit point of view. But, I do think, just honestly, after this week, Hal Hirschfeld for me is like maybe one of the next kind of honestly breakout stars. If she can really earn a regular spot on this U.S. women's national team over the next year or two, like just her ease in interviews, her personality, everything she does on the field, I'm like, you've kind of got it all right at the moment. I can see you really going places. But I just also want to see Hal Hirschfeld getting under the skin of every single England player, just from it would personally amuse me standpoint.
Yeah, peace be to her quadriceps as well, since we're talking about it. But yes, Casey Kruger, like, there are a few of these girls who are going to be feeling it, let's say, but totally agree. She really, like, clicked into another gear, I think, midway through the season. Her whole rookie season with the Spirit was fantastic, but between her sort of, like, presence, sort of turning a little bit more to the public and allowing us to see her personality, both the silliness and the dog that we see on the field, has been really exciting. Yeah. And yeah, I can't wait to see her going up against Georgia Stanway, Kiera Walsh. It's going to be a good time. Let's shift our attention like squarely to the attack though, Meg, because between the forwards who have been called, Yasmin Ryan, Emma Sears, Ali Sentnor, Jaden Shaw, Alyssa Thompson, and Lynn Williams, there are 107 caps total between them, but Lynn has 73 of those. Honestly,
I was going to say, like, it's all Lynn.
It's all Lynn. All in all the time. But it does make me wonder if Emma Hayes sees in Lynn a veteran sort of mentorship role with these players, and if so, I love that for her. It makes total sense. I didn't see it until I saw this roster, though. Are you seeing it too?
Yeah, totally. And I think the other part of that too is I go back to the selection of the Olympic roster and the way that Emma Hayes talked about Lynn Williams in the selection of the Olympic roster. And she's like, she wasn't in the camps. I hadn't really seen her. She reaches out to me, like, I think she appreciates Lynn Williams from a personality standpoint so much. Just every time she talks about her, I'm like, you love Lynn Williams and like what she offers to this team in terms of character, in terms of drive, in terms of like being that player that will do anything, right, at any point. And having her be that anchor for the rest of this group. Like, obviously there's someone in Yasmin Ryan that she plays with all the time at Gotham, but you think about the youth, right, of this front batch, and it is really interesting to kind of see like Mama Bear Lynn gonna come in and guide these kids through this little European trip. But this is such a chance for someone like a Jaden Shaw, for Alyssa Thompson, right, who have had, I think, already these standout early parts of their career to maybe get this chance of, okay, your triple espresso line is gone. Who's going to step up and be that main point of contention for the next cycle to like really make it hard for Emma Hayes? And so there's nothing flashier than a Wembley game in front of 80,000 plus to make that statement.
Completely. I'm thinking also of just the influence of her signature defensive skills as an attacking player and how helpful it will be for players like Alyssa Thompson, Ali, Emma, who have already been sort of like incorporating that into their game to see that in action, especially in a big game like this. It seems like a type of investment in a way to be having them studying alongside Lynn in this window. Anything else that we need to sort of wring out from this roster? There's a lot to unpack. Players like Alyssa Melanson, who also had an incredible showing during her debut, are going to be back. It's going to be a good one, though. No doubt.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like everybody is kind of very heavily focused on this England game. Netherlands, obviously, last game of the year. A lot of injuries going through, Viv Miedema still out for the Netherlands. So it is going to be, I think, kind of an interesting window just to see. Again, I think the goals are obviously, the goal is always to win for the U.S. women's national team, but there are those bigger picture goals, especially considering where they are in the cycle. I think, having 2 games in Europe, very good development opportunity, but I still kind of think the thing that everybody's really waiting for is January. And that January camp with the full senior team and the futures camp, and who gets called in and what happens with the pool then. Like, I don't want to say that we're in this kind of stasis period, but I do think that is like the next big thing that everyone is waiting for, just to get a sense of really where this team is ahead of World Cup qualification in 2026 and the World Cup in 2027.
I agree. This window for the U.S. definitely feels like a closing arguments for that January camp, especially for these newer players. So you can watch the game in that sense too, and I think that will actually make it even more interesting, because looking at that front line especially, it is going to be a little crowded for the best possible reasons. And that's just going to add a lot more to the game. But I agree, Netherlands are never an easy opponent. I'm thinking of the sort of like beef that was seasoned during the World Cup last year, and the chipping between Lindsey Horan and Danielle Van de Donk, between Lynette Bjornstein's comments about the U.S. Like, there is gonna be like lots of chips and dip in that game on shoulders. England, in addition to the U.S., will be playing Switzerland, and the Netherlands, in addition to the U.S., will be playing China. Those will also be very interesting matchups, particularly, I think, the Netherlands and China, because that's not one that we see very often. So make sure to... I followed China a bit during the World Cup last year, and they've got some quality. So that should be a pretty even and interesting one. But mark your calendars, because these games are going to be important, as we've mentioned, for many reasons. And honestly, I hope all of you listening get a break too, because it has been a long season in the NWSL. It's been an Olympic year. We have been rolling, barely catching our breath as we go. And for those of you who do celebrate Thanksgiving, now is actually, I think, the perfect time to slow it down, feel the belly, like I said, warm fuzzy sock vibes. But if you have thoughts about this roster, about what you're hoping to see out of the U.S. women's national team in this pair of friendlies, reach out to us, because let's be real, even in relaxation, we're all going to be on our phones still scrolling. But make sure that you're following us at TA Fulltime on Instagram, TikTok. We have plenty of content to tide you over through the holidays up until the weekend. And if you prefer to email, we're always available at fulltime@theathletic.com. I am Tamerra Griffin. I am alongside Meg Linehan, and you've been listening to Fulltime with Meg Linehan. If you need me, I will be perfecting my mac and cheese recipe on Instagram and Twitter.
All right, it's Meg. I'm on Blue Sky. If you want even more behind, there's some great photos of the full-time squad on my Instagram. You can see, God bless Jeff and Danny at the KC Current for closing out the stadium with us in KC, but them running towards our group shot in the background. Highly recommend, but we appreciate them. Maddie at the NWSL so much. It was truly a great championship weekend. We're looking forward to these U.S. games. We will, thanks for listening.
Full Time is not possible without our podcast producer, Theo Lloyd-Hughes, video producer, Leah Griffin, and executive producer, Emily Olson. Thank you, as always, for listening, and we will be back in our normal scheduled slot Thursday next week. We'll see you there.